We're excited. Today we have with us Kristofer Phan Coffman, who is a friend and colleague of ours. He is the assistant professor of New Testament at Luther Seminary and the scholar who revised the content on our website for the Gospel of Mark. So excited that we're here in the Gospels. And yeah, tell us just a little bit, a summary of the Gospel, and what is the Gospel of Mark all about, Kristofer? And welcome.
I'm glad to be here to talk about Mark. They say you're not supposed to have favorites, but Mark is my favorite gospel. And so I'm excited for introducing this. So the first thing that people will probably notice about Mark when we talk about what's going on in it or summarizing it is it ends and begins in different places than you might expect. It begins right in the middle of things with the coming of John the Baptist into the wilderness of the Jordan. So there's no birth narratives. We don't hear anything about Joseph or Mary or any of that.
Yeah.
And instead we start right with John the Baptist. And then if we fast forward to the end, what we see is that the ending of the Gospel of Mark is a little bit confusing in that if you look at your Bibles, you'll see there's all sorts of brackets and asterisks and all sorts of things talking about the fact that there's more than one ending that is preserved in the biblical text. Yeah. And so one of the things we see, though, is that with all of these endings, they end in a somewhat mysterious fashion. It is probable that the very earliest ending of Mark ends with the women fleeing the tomb afraid. So it's we don't even see the resurrected Jesus there. Yeah. And we can talk a little bit more about that in terms of the issues going on in Mark. And then in between, Mark is fairly clearly divided. The first 8 chapters or so take place in Galilee and feature Jesus and especially his healing miracles and his exorcisms. There is a brief interlude where Jesus and the disciples travel from Galilee to Jerusalem. And during their travel, Jesus gives his 3 predictions of the Passion, his coming death and resurrection. And then once we get to Jerusalem, we have the triumphal entry, where Jesus rides in to Jerusalem and is hailed by the crowds as the Son of David. And then we have a number of controversy narratives where someone will come to ask Jesus a question, or Jesus will ask somebody a question, and they'll debate back and forth. And then finally, the last 3 chapters of Mark. The action starts to slow down, and we see the arrest of Jesus, the trial of Jesus, and the crucifixion of Jesus. And then, as I said, it ends with the empty tomb.
So it's the shortest gospel, right?
Significantly so, yes.
Yeah.
It's about probably 2/3 as long as the other 2 gospels, or the other 3 gospels, excuse me.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us why it's your favorite gospel, Kristofer?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I find very intriguing about the Gospel of Mark. The first is that it is the most mysterious of the Gospels. Mark does not do a lot of explaining for his readers.
Yeah.
In fact, he invites us into some very profound mysteries, one of which that people tend to notice right away is Jesus does a very mysterious thing in Galilee where he's constantly telling people not to talk about him. He will perform a miracle, and he will then command the recipient of the miracle not to tell anybody. He will perform an exorcism, and he will command the demons not to tell anybody. So we have, again, we call this in gospel scholarship the Messianic secret.
Yeah.
There's something mysterious about Jesus. The second thing, and this is...
I was just going to say, is that because he's trying to do like the Streisand effect? When you tell someone not to look at something or talk about it, that's the only thing they can do, or...
It appears in some cases that's what it is, because most of the people who he tells this to ignore him and go out and tell everybody that they know about it. So there's some kind of irony there.
Yeah.
The second thing is that Mark is... And this is subjective, but Mark is in many ways the most humorous of the Gospels.
Really?
Especially so we talked about the controversy narratives in Jerusalem.
Yep.
Mark makes a lot of note about how delighted the crowds are by Jesus's wit and humor and the way in which he asks these evasive and pointed questions that make his adversaries look ridiculous. And so there's this real humor in Mark as well. And then finally, on a more theological level, one of the other things that I do as a professor of New Testament is I teach the letter to the Romans and the epistles of Paul. Mark is the gospel that has the most in common with Paul and the way that Paul preaches the gospel. And so because of that, I think it's very interesting to see the resonances and the parallels between the two of them.
Can you give us an example of that, Christopher?
Yeah.
How Mark parallels Paul or is similar to Paul's
Yes,
message?
and it comes right in Mark 1:1.
All
Mark
right.
is the only one of the gospels that calls itself a gospel. So in Mark 1:1, we see this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And this is, I think, almost certainly a reference to Paul, because it is Paul who coins this terminology, gospel, for this story and preaching about Jesus that he is doing in his career. And so Mark seems very consciously to be picking up on this and to call what he's doing a gospel in relationship to this.
That was the question
Keep
I was
going.
going to ask. Is Paul reading Mark or is Mark reading Paul? And so you're saying you think Mark is aware of Paul by the time he gets to the point that he writes down the gospel.
I think so. So in terms of the sort of Christian tradition around the Gospel of Mark, Mark is historically said to have been written by John Mark, who is one of the followers of the Apostle Paul. We meet him in the book of Acts. He and John Mark and Barnabas are two of Paul's traveling companions.
Yeah.
And I think that it is the way in which Paul uses the term gospel in his letters is very distinct. And so it makes more sense for Paul to have coined that phrase and then Mark to have borrowed it than the other way around.
Yeah,
but again, these are things we are speculating on just as much as we know them.
Sure. So who is Mark writing to? Is it Gentiles, Jews, a mixture? Do we know? What's the theory about that?
Yeah, this is one of those things that I want to say that we are speculating on this. We can look for context clues in Mark that might help us to understand this. One of the things that we see is that Mark does take the time to explain to his audience both what he sees as particularly Jewish customs. We get a reference to the fact that in one of Jesus' statements about whether things are clean or unclean, Mark explains to his audience that it is a particularly Jewish practice to wash cups and wash vessels in a particular way. He also feels the need to translate Aramaic phrases for his audience. So Mark is written in Greek, as all the Gospels are, but in Mark's case especially, when we get Aramaic phrasing, he almost always translates it for his audience. And then Mark contains one or two Latin loanwords. And so some folks have wondered whether this means that Mark is associated with the city of Rome or is associated with Latin knowledge. That one's a little bit more uncertain. But the idea being that this is for people who are probably similar to Paul's audience. Okay. They are people in the greater Roman world who are Greek speakers, who are very interested in the person of Jesus, maybe know something about the traditions of the Old Testament and the Jewish people, but are not familiar enough with it that they don't need some handholds as they are walked through the story.
So if you had to summarize like the message or messages of Mark, like what does the writer of the Gospel of Mark want his readers to know about Jesus or about Jesus's story?
Yeah. So, and this again is a thing that Mark shares strongly in common with Paul as opposed to Matthew and Luke so much. Number one is that Mark is very interested in the question of what it means to have faith in Jesus. And so we see the way in which Mark talks a lot about discipleship and what it means to follow Jesus. But then even more important than that, it seems to Mark is a gospel of conflict. And it's specifically a gospel of conflict between Jesus and the demonic powers. From the very beginning of his gospel, we see that Jesus is not all that, that's not quite fair to say. It's not that he's not concerned with the worldly adversaries that he has, but that his real fight is on a cosmic level. And so we see this with the way in which Jesus encounters the demonic forces in Galilee. Especially important here is in Mark chapter 5, the story of the Gerasene demoniac and this.
That's the guy who's in the in the graveyard, right? Running around naked and freaking out, and all the people are like, we don't know what's wrong with that guy, but it's really bad. And then Jesus heals him and casts the demons out.
Into a herd of pigs. Yeah. But the
pigs
kind of spooky part about it is Jesus says, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit," and asks the demon, "What is your name?" And the demon says, "My name is Legion, for we are many." I mean, spooky, right? And it's that kind of cosmic, battle with the unclean, with the demonic spirits.
Paul talks a lot about that, right? Like powers and principalities. Our fight is not with the forces of the world, but with the powers and principalities that fight against God, etc.
Yeah, very much so. And along with that, you see kind of a couple things. So first of all, that legion, that's one of those Latin loan words that people have pointed out. But also it's the point that you made, Katie, in terms of, despite the fact that Jesus has, quote unquote, solved the problem of the demoniac here by casting out the demons, the people are not very happy to have him around. Right. There's this sense that Jesus's mission and Jesus's actions are unsettling. Yeah. And this occurs throughout Mark. And then, as I said, kind of within that same vein of thought, in some ways, the real high point of Mark's narrative is in Mark 14 at the trial of Jesus, where Jesus in his trial comes straight out and proclaims that he is the Messiah and that he will come again on the clouds of heaven. And that this is sort of the culmination of this conflict that Jesus has had with these demonic forces over the course of the gospel, is his prediction of his return at the end of time, the second coming. And so you can see that Mark really places that in a very prominent part of the narrative, in slight distinction to the other gospels.
So it's very apocalyptic, to use that scary word, right? Like it's very much concerned about the cosmic and maybe even ultimate fate of the world and how Jesus fits into that.
Yep, very much so.
Which is interesting that that's sort of the theological concern of the book, or one of the main theological concerns of the book, and yet we don't get a vision of, or a picture of Jesus as a resurrected, right? Jesus is like, we get the empty tomb, but we don't get the actual resurrected Lord. So that seems a little paradoxical to me.
Yeah, you have two things going on there that I think are very interesting. And I think you're right. It is somewhat of a paradox. The first, and this goes again to continue that theme of Jesus is slightly unsettling. The message that the angel at the tomb gives to the women is not unambiguously good. So the message that he gives to the disciples, so the angel tells the women, go tell his disciples that he is going to meet you in Galilee, like he told you. And so there is a little bit of a, why are you waiting around in Jerusalem sort of thing? You know what you're supposed to do going on. And of course, what is their reaction? They flee in terror. So there's that going on. But then also Mark, later in its history, as we talked about, that's probably the original ending of Mark. But it gets associated with a set of longer endings, one of which does depict the resurrected Jesus, but in the context of Jesus's proclamation that his followers will be able to tread on poisonous snakes and drink poison and deal with all scorpions and things like that. So again, still this continued kind of unsettling continuation of the story, so to speak, is very characteristic of Mark.
So when you talk about the shorter ending and or the original ending and the longer ending, maybe if you could explain that a little more for our listeners.
Yeah, happy to do so. So it's important to remember that when we think about the biblical text, we have many, many copies of it that then are put together and collated and compared by scholars to come up with the text that then is printed as what we think of as the Bible. Some of these are older than others. Some of these are in better condition than others, and so forth. So in our manuscripts that are in the best condition and are the oldest, Mark ends at Mark 16:8. And the women fled, for they were terrified. They fled and they said nothing to anyone, which is even more interesting. Right?
Which is objectively not true, because here it is written down.
Exactly. Somebody, they
Someone
eventually
said
broke their
something.
silence. Yep. Yeah. But then in later editions, so later copies of the Gospel of Mark, we get these other endings that are then added to it. And so this is why we talk about the shorter ending in Mark versus the longer ending.
And we think that the longer endings were like probably tagged on by by folks who didn't appreciate how unsettling that ending was. And they were like, well, we need to wrap this up a little bit more neatly, or.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of it. As we talked about, it's not that the ending that they added is less unsettling, but it's unsettling in, I suppose, a slightly different way.
Got it.
Yeah, but I think there is a way in which, and we'll talk about this, Mark is constantly compared to Matthew and Luke because they share so much in common.
Right.
And so I think in many ways there was an attachment of a tradition similar to Matthew and Luke to the end of Mark, because in this way, it, as you said, kind of completes the story in some ways.
Yeah, that makes sense. So before we started recording and going off of what you just said, Kristofer, we talked about Mark as a kind of underappreciated gospel, especially compared to Matthew and Luke, with which it shares a number of stories, right? We get a number of stories and sayings of Jesus that are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and some in John as well. So why do you think it's underappreciated, and how would you remedy that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things going on there. The first, I do want to make the point that it's not just that some of Mark is shared with Matthew and Luke. It is almost the entirety of the gospel is reproduced in Matthew, and then almost the entirety in Luke. There's a couple stories that are not. Perhaps the most notable is there is a healing that Jesus does in the middle of Mark that takes a second try. So he is healing the eyes of a man, and he opens his eyes and does not see properly, and then Jesus. So that is left out of Matthew and Luke. But otherwise, almost the entirety of Mark is taken over into Matthew. This is partially just the tradition of church history in the West. So the very famous Christian theologian Augustine, sometimes called Augustine, was of the opinion that Mark was a summary of Matthew, and his opinion carried great weight in the Western church, and so that's part of why it was underappreciated. Another thing, though, is that, and again, this is part of what we call the reception history of the text, is that many of the favorite stories, so to speak, of people who are intimately connected with the Christian faith are not in Mark. So you will not find the Sermon on the Mount in Mark or the Lord's Prayer in Mark. You will not find, for instance, all of the parables that people love from Luke, the Good Samaritan and the lost sheep and so forth. And so there are ways in which these very important stories from Matthew and Luke, which really form people's faith and which really are what people hang their hats on when they think about the Gospels, they're not in Mark. And so Mark also kind of recedes in that way. And then another thing, too, and this is one of the ways in which Gospels are received, is in the lectionary. And in the historic lectionary of the Western Church, Mark is not given much space because if you have Matthew or you have Luke, you have all the stories from Mark already. And so you can then kind of fill in without quote unquote, needing Mark to fill in any gaps in your narrative. In a way that, for instance, John, because it is so different, gets a lot more space because you want to have those stories from John and those sermons from John within the lectionary. And so again, I think these are a lot of the things that contribute to it being underappreciated. When you talk, though, about how do you remedy that, or how do you,
or how would you make an argument that it is in fact worth attention?
We should appreciate it more. Yeah, we should move it from unappreciated to properly appreciated.
I agree. And I think in that sense, I would really point towards the way in which Mark and, for instance, Romans or Galatians are really fruitful books to read together. That if you read Romans and you see Paul is in some ways talking in a very philosophical, theological way about things, and then you read Mark alongside of that, much of what Paul says is embodied in the text of Mark. And so I think that these are ways in which Mark is a very, like I said, a very fruitful gospel to read with the letters of Paul. This gets us to the difficulty, though, that then the letters of Paul need to be appreciated more in order for us to...
Which is another
And we'll get to
podcast.
this series as well. We'll get to those in this series as well. I love Paul. I love Paul.
So you said before Matthew and Luke have all or almost all of the stories that are in Mark. So if Augustine thought that Mark was a summary of Matthew, modern scholars think, in fact, that Mark was a source for Matthew and Luke. Is that correct, Kristofer? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and so it's for a number of reasons. The two most important ones are, number one, as we talked about, the things that are left out of Mark, to use that phrasing. So, for instance, like the story of the double healing. It makes a lot of sense why Matthew would be uncomfortable with including that story. It makes less sense why Mark would add it if it's not in Matthew. In the sense that this seems to be a healing that, takes
a minute.
Takes 2 tries in terms of the way that Jesus is working here. So that's part of it, is that when we look at what's left out of Matthew, it makes more sense that it was left out rather than it was added by Mark. The other thing, again, and this goes a little bit more to the way in which Mark does not explain things that Matthew and Luke do. And so Matthew and Luke in some ways seem to be expanding upon Mark. Matthew especially will take the narrative of Mark and add these references to the Old Testament, to prophecy, and in some ways seems really to be fleshing out the narrative of Mark. And again, it's a little bit harder to understand if Mark is a summary, why it is that Mark would leave out this very important material in terms of how Jesus fits in with the greater story of the people of Israel and so forth. And again, as we say with any of these things, these are conjectures. These are arguments that we are making based on, we wish we knew more, but it does seem more probable that Mark is first and then expanded upon by Matthew and Luke.
No, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Thank you for all that information, Kristofer. One thing that I recall about Mark, and this is from there was a professor at the seminary I went to who had memorized the whole Gospel of Mark in English, and
who was that?
Kind of a David Rhodes. So he would recite the whole thing, but kind of act it out with his voice. And the thing I remember about about that performance is there was a sense of urgency, right? Like over and over again, Mark says, and immediately, right? And immediately this next thing happened and this next thing happened. So I'm just curious how you read that. And does it go back to that idea of, or that claim that the conflict here is between cosmic powers, right? That Jesus, as the Son of Man, as the Messiah, is in this urgent kind of battle with demonic forces.
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things to that. First of all, I would say that many readers have noted, especially in contrast to Matthew and Luke, the immediacy of Mark. And one of the key ways that this shows up is that Mark contains, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything we would characterize as a sermon. So all of the other Gospels are marked by the fact that at some point Jesus pauses in the action and gives a long set of teaching.
Yeah.
Mark makes reference to the fact that Jesus teaches, but he does not give that teaching to us in the context of the Gospel. So that's one thing that I think gives it this sense of continual motion.
That's really interesting.
I think part of it, though, is I do want to caution us a little bit in that is partially a result of reading Mark after Matthew and Luke. I think that Mark, if read first, does not seem quite as immediate, and especially in comparison with other genres of ancient literature. If you read, for example, like the Iliad or the Odyssey, which are Greek poems that also narrate action, they move at about the same pace. It's not that Mark moves any faster than them. But I think that it's very fair to say, though, that Mark, in that sense, is moving his narrative along, that he really is, he wants you to know that Jesus is a teacher, but unlike for Matthew and Luke, it is not his teaching which constitutes who he really is. It is his actions, and it is especially, as we said, this conflict that drives Mark forward. And so that, I think, really does give it that sense of immediacy and that sense of I think I would maybe say, instead of immediacy, that sense of perpetual motion. Jesus is doing things in Mark and going places kind of throughout. Whereas in Matthew and Luke, Jesus stops for a breather. And then in John, we get John in quite strong contrast. We get many, many long discourses.
Very chatty in John. He's very chatty.
Yeah.
This has been amazing. So many rich insights. If you could think of just one key takeaway, one key nugget that you would want someone who's maybe diving in more deeply into the Gospel of Mark for the first time to kind of be thinking about as they read, what would it be?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing as you read the Gospel of Mark is to keep that first line of the Gospel in mind. This is the good news of Jesus Christ. And then you have to ask yourself, what is the good news that Mark is trying to tell us? Is it the whole thing? Is there a particular moment or a particular ethos that Mark is trying to tell us is the good news? And I do think that there is a way in which, if you're trying to ask the question, what does Mark think the good news about Jesus is? It comes very early in the gospel, where Jesus tells what is often called the parable of the strong man.
Mm-hmm.
And it is that Jesus has come because the world is captive, and Jesus and the strong man in the parable is Satan. And Jesus has come to plunder Satan's house. And so there is this image of Jesus taking things away from Satan. But, and this is what is really interesting about that, Mark then immediately combines that motif with the motif that Jesus comes to lay down his life as a ransom for many. And so Mark holds in tension, as Paul does, the conflict and the strength of Jesus with the fact that this strength is manifest in his crucifixion, that his crucifixion is also his glorification. And so I think that this is, as Mark thinks about what is the gospel, he's holding these two things up for you to see. And again, it's this gospel of motion, that you see these things in action as you move through the 16 chapters of Mark.
That's really profound. Thank you, Kristofer. So that Jesus' power over Satan is manifest in Jesus' self-giving love on the cross. And then, of course, the empty tomb, the resurrection. But yeah, that's a really powerful message, and one that is certainly good news, both for Mark's original listeners, readers, and for us as well. So thank you so much, Kristofer, for providing us that wonderful introduction to the Gospel of Mark. Yeah. And we encourage our listeners to go to enterthebible.org, where you can get so much more information about the Gospel of Mark and every biblical book, actually. We have background information. We have discussion of theological themes. We have exploration of specific passages from the Gospel of Mark. We have a section called Bible in the World that talks about the influence of Mark in Christian theology and history, and so much more. We have videos, we have blog posts, we have maps, a glossary of biblical terms and biblical people, and other podcast episodes. Lots of information there at enterthebible.org. So we encourage our listeners to go there for more information. We also encourage you to rate us on your favorite podcast app, like and subscribe, and if you appreciated this podcast, please share it with a friend. Until next time.